I'm delighted today to welcome you to a special program with Jim Folsom, the Telleen Jorgenson Director of Botanical Gardens at the Huntington, who sadly for us is retiring in 29 days after an incredibly successful 36-year career. This special program is part of a series that we launched last year for the Huntington Centennial called Why It Matters. Jim is going to talk about why and how plants and gardens matter. I've overlapped with Jim for 2.5 years at the Huntington. And I remember, and that is actually 1/18 of his tenure at the Huntington. I remember vividly being interviewed for this position that I hold now, and having the search committee ask me a question at my interview. They said, of the 3 collections, the library, art, and botanical gardens, if I got the job, which one would represent the steepest learning curve for me? It was a pretty easy call. The botanical gardens were the biggest stretch for me, both professionally and personally. But most of you know that Jim is a great teacher and has deep expertise and a love of all things botanical and an uncanny ability to make observations that alter the way people see the world. So in the 2.5 years that we've been together at the Huntington, I've learned a tremendous amount from him. For example, Jim has taught me that only 200 species of plants provide the world's food supply. For a botanical novice, that was pretty astounding fact. Jim arrived at the Huntington in 1984, and he was 34 at the time. He was assistant curator of the Botanical Gardens. In 3 years, he was promoted to the top job. And some of the botanical staff who were there then and are still here have recalled being headquartered in trailers, and that the 130 gardens now open to the public were barely tamed tracts of land. The novelist Penelope Lively has written, and I'm going to quote, that gardening is a fusion of physical endeavor with a dream of things to come. So for 36 years, the Huntington has been incredibly fortunate to have a director who has both dirt under his fingernails and big, big dreams. Together with Jim's dedicated staff, he's transformed our gardens into the expansive and welcoming spaces that greet you when you walk through the doors, through the gates of the Huntington. They're combined with programming, conservation, research that has expanded the impact of our extraordinary collection of over 15,000 types of living plants. Recognitions of Jim's accomplishments have been national and global. He recently received the highest award and most prestigious award from the American Horticultural Society. And from the nation of Japan, the Order of the Rising Sun, gold rays with rosette. At the Huntington, we're honoring his legacy in a number of ways by establishing an endowment for Jim's highest priority, the Jim Folsom Gardens Equipment Replacement Fund. For those of you who may not know Jim, that may sound like an unusual request, but it's classic Jim. In order to enable his staff going forward to get stuff done and to be able to do it with good equipment. So far, with Don Conlon's help, we have raised $1.3 million for that fund. Secondly, by resolution of the Board of Trustees, we are naming our ranch garden in honor of Jim and for Jim. Again, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a working vegetable garden that has a demonstration space so that families, children, the public can learn about sustainable urban gardening. And it's another example of Jim's commitment to education. It will now be called the James P. Folsom Experimental Ranch Garden in recognition of his transformative accomplishments. And Jim will now have the honorary title of Emeritus Director of Botanical Gardens, which is a first for the Huntington. But Jim's legacy isn't just written in our landscape or in a title. It's really in the hearts and minds of the Huntington community, and particularly the botanical staff, some of whom have worked with him for a very long time. So we thought we'd share a video at the start so that you can hear some of the staff talk about Jim and his legacy. So Ben, would you please run the video?
3 words I would use to describe Jim would be boundless, enthusiastic, and kind.
Passionate, a mentor, and inspirational. He might be one of the most brilliant people I've ever met in my life, and I've been in some good company at times.
In thinking of the 3 words to describe Jim, I have to borrow from one of our generous garden governors, Don Conlon, because he recently described Jim as a boiling cauldron of creativity.
If I could combine 2 together, the first thing out of my mouth would be ever ready, bunny.
Jim is, like a seed. Nothing is going to stop him from fulfilling his vision.
A little chaotic at times, but he's fabulous because he's got that vision.
One thing I've learned from Jim specifically is never exercise a valve unless you're ready to replace it.
Words to describe Jim, well, polymath for sure. He knows a lot about a lot of things.
He is not the average mortal, and I see this every day when I go to meetings. He talks about the 17 other things he is balancing on the tip of his finger, and it just blows me away.
He always just approaches everything with this kind of hopeful, optimistic mindset that it can be done, you can achieve great things, and it's really inspiring to be around someone like that.
Jim also taught me that the gardens really should be for everyone, that the Huntington Gardens are accessible and interesting and compelling to as many people as possible.
Jim once said, only half jokingly, that he wouldn't be satisfied until all of his staff were as overcommitted as he was.
He hired me to do survey and whatever else came along. I quickly found out that Jim had a lot on his plate and some of it fell off in my direction, and I should expect something new every day.
He literally opened up the door for me and many other people here in the institution over the years to find their passion anew.
I know number 1 was Jim, brought me down here, which I really enjoy the garden and be involved with the people and the kids in the school. Amazing, amazing. I mean, I don't know how I can thank him,
he's also working with the hoe. It was kind of not funny, but interesting to see him in this position too, and not just as the director of the Botanical Garden.
He did set out a 25-year plan in 1995 for what he was going to accomplish by 2020, and he's ticked it all off the list.
Okay, let's do this, let's do that, let's build this. He's always energetic, he's always coming up with ideas, and he's always making sure that this place is looking just perfect.
The children's garden did not exist before Jim. The conservatory, the botanical center, these greenhouses, the Chinese garden. He expanded the rose garden. The desert garden is getting a makeover as we speak. There isn't a square inch in the garden that he hasn't had an impact or influenced.
He always has things to share with you, have story to tell, and his vision is 100 years ahead of us.
And we are the 3rd institution in the United States doing research on cryopreservation, and that is mainly because of his vision on the future.
Yeah, none of these things weren't here when he started. All this, he's the one that built all this for people to see and for us, you know.
I've heard Jim say many, many times, it's surprising how much you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit.
Personally, I think they'd need 3 people to replace him, given the energy he has, the knowledge he's been able to give to everyone here.
I will miss basically having a friend who listens, a brother who listens, and a father who listens. I basically came to this country with no brother, no father, no family, by myself, and he was there for me the whole time.
I know he wants to be a gentleman farmer and keep growing his food, but I hope he keeps asking questions about the plants he loves because he's good at it, and I think there's still some more interesting discoveries he'll make.
I think that's the end of my story for right now. I could go on probably, well, for years, because I've worked with Jim for years, but we'll just leave it at that for now.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Incredibly moving tributes, no? So before we sit down virtually together for conversation and then take questions from the audience, Jim has agreed to summarize some of the lessons learned over this long career. So here's Jim.
Okay, can people see my screen? It's become my new way of communicating, PowerPoint and Keynote through the airwaves.
Looks good, Jim.
Okay, great. Well, I'm gonna move through this quickly because we want to give people a chance to ask questions, and maybe some people can answer some of the questions that other people ask. I just wanted to put some images down as like the beginning course in a discussion. And I think about the Huntington. I think that we deal with the present, the future, and we all deal with it on the plate of the past. And there's still good things about the past that make sense to us. And one of the things is when we teach young children about plants, we try to boil it down to something that's digestible. And we use the word lawn. All of the gardens docents know this term, lawn: light, air, water, nutrients. It really boils down to something profoundly ancient, which is every society's interest in earth, air, fire, water, as the elements that make up the sort of non-living part of the earth. And it's fascinating that those elements, being beautiful and sometimes horrific, those elements don't give life. What gives life is the green mantle that covers the earth. And that's been borne out in other ancient ideas: animal, vegetable, mineral. And the mineral world is the platform. This drawing doesn't really help you much because it makes it look like, as always, the human is on top and the human is presiding and reigning over all of these wonderful steps in this wonderful world. But in reality, there's a foundation here of earth. But the next foundation is this mantle of green. It's not just that one step. It's the green plants. We call them autotrophs in the botanical world. They take that very non-living, almost raw world of earth, air, fire, and water, and create the life that sustains all the rest of us stranded here at the top of the steps or the top of the pyramid. And how do they do that? Of course, that's one of the things we love to share with people is plants are green. Being green is, as Kermit says, not that easy. But in a way, it's kind of easy because the green is cast off its waste light. The plants are busy extracting red and blue light and using that light to do incredibly interesting things. And in the process, rejecting, reflecting, transmitting the leftover green, which makes us, which forms the world in which we evolved. So at the center of our visual spectrum is green. And it's just so curious. Plants are green. We see green better than any color. And it's all because plants don't use green light. What else do plants use? Earth, air, fire, and water. Plants harvest the sunlight, but they farm the atmosphere. And I think people, it's astonishing to realize that the atmosphere is the greatest source of food on the planet. here is this invisible thing, this air, and in it, at its tiniest percentages, 0.04% carbon dioxide, plants are farming that carbon dioxide, bringing it into the green parts of the plants. Here are some leaves. This is botany in the herb garden. Here's English oak, the California native oak, just looking through that greenness. And plants are bringing that carbon dioxide in, and they are using that to build the sugars. And indeed, it is true, all flesh is grass. The world is covered now with so much agricultural zone, over 60%, almost 70% of the agriculture of the tillable, usable land, and not even tillable, usable land on earth is in pasture to feed that carnivorous streak in us as heterotrophs. But the largest covering of agricultural land on earth in a crop is wheat. Wheat is indeed the source of life in so many cultures. And breads tell you a lot about the people that have figured out how to live in their different habitats. And breads come from wheat, corn, rice, the three most important grains on the face of the planet that constitute the bulk of our calories. Of course, there's wonderful things like fruit. And there's botanical lessons. We won't get into that today. But in the end, humans are benefiting. We are the heterotrophs. We're at the top of this funny little plant ladder. It's the plants that are feeding us. And so here you see CH2O. That's, the basic formula for carbohydrates. And here's the potato. Here's the college student eating his French fries, and some carbon dioxide being shunting off, and the plants are taking the carbon dioxide and creating all of the sugars that make all these starches. But in the process, they're doing something other absolutely phenomenal. They are at the same time creating oxygen, which is all the oxygen we breathe. So here we have this very tight relationship. We're not doing the work. The plants are doing all the work. Well, now, when they create that oxygen, they do something else. They make an unusual thing. They make a flammable atmosphere, which is a rusting, an oxidizing atmosphere. And you've read a lot about that. You know that the world, things are not going in a good direction when you think about the energy on the world scene. Everything is going not downhill, but energy, heat is moving from places of concentration into places of deficit. Plants in this whole world of energy, the thermodynamics really came about as a science and as an understanding based on the fact that people started mining coal, which is, once again, mainly a plant product. So here coal becomes the source, the whole impetus behind the Industrial Revolution, and the whole reason we had to come to understand energy transfer and thermodynamics. And here's the rules of the house. These are the three laws. You can't win. That means heat only goes in toward cold. Heat does not build on top of heat. You can't draw even. So there's not going to be any increase in energy. It's all going to even out over time. So plants are busy doing things for us. They're busy creating all our food. They're busy making all of our oxygen. They also are busy making our habitats and creating the products we use. Here's a pine forest. Here is Mr. Nakamura. Nakamura is our chief designer and architect and craftsman who works with us from Japan in the buildings in the Japanese garden, and is currently working on restoration and reconstruction of the Yokoi house back in the Japanese garden. Here is Nakamura in one of his 7 warehouses of drop dead beautiful wood, all drying and curing for future uses and high level craftsmanship. So here's Kelly in our herb garden, Kelly Fernandez, who grows crops of flax, which is the oldest crop known to be harvested and used for textiles and for all sorts of fiber purposes. Almost all of the ancient books in the library are printed on linen paper, which is made from flax. Plants not only feed us, they not only give us oxygen, they underwrite our entire lives. And we interact with plants in a very particularly human way. Here's a hand. This is one of the first radiographs ever made of a hand held by the library in the Burndy collection. And you can see the gunshot. It was being x-rayed because of the gunshot. But our hands remind us that we are bipedal, bidextrous, stereoscopically driven, binary creatures that face a world in a certain way. Here's Da Vinci's obsession with mirror images that even carries into this mysterious painting, the Mona Lisa, in which it just seems so obvious that he probably painted that in a mirror to be able to achieve the effect he wanted. So we depend, plants are the world, they create the world around us, form and substance, from decorating the sunrise and nature itself. So it's plants as part of nature. And this is the world in which we evolved as humans. And yet we pay little attention to it anymore. Who has a moment to pay real attention to a sunrise or a sunset, or to stare at the moon? Last night was the full moon. Who took a moment to think about that and its meaning? The seasons, we've lost track somehow of really important things, and we take so much for granted in our world. Made a trip recently and saw the Alabama Hills with the Lipsigs, and this was a fascinating revelation. There's a wonderful outcropping there, and we look at it in a very human way. You're driving through and it's just there, so you take it for granted. But when we turn our attention to it, we can get obsessively analytic. The Alabama Hills, we want to know its size, its weight, its age, the hardness of the stones. But at the other end, it's totally emotional. Here we are in the Alabama Hills, and all around you, you see faces and you see images, things that drive you emotionally and lead to different forms of creativity. So when I was there, I was stricken with the fact that it was so barren and yet beautiful at the same time. And I was also stricken with the fact that there are some plants that can really tough it out. So here's a composite, and here's a cactus just living in the cracks in these rocks, something that is almost unimaginably difficult. How do they do that? This is part of our world, and the barrenness of our world is so compensated by the beautiful, life-giving nature of plants and what they bring to us, and they end up being part of our whole system of observation and our whole system of imagery and symbolism. Embedded in our lives. Plants, nature indeed is embedded in our lives. We can't separate ourselves from nature. In fact, if you go visit our Chinese garden, you'll find that we have an authentic piece of the sky. Nuwa tried to restore the heavens after they were calamitously destroyed, and the pieces were picked up and put back in a colorful pattern in the sky. But there was one piece that never made it. The sky is incomplete. We have that at the Huntington. It's called Butian. It's in the Chinese garden. The skies swirl around us, and in the sky there are all these forms that we use for imagery. Here's a borrowed piece from the Quinn family in the art gallery of a series of birds. Flowers yield so much imagery. The grinning chestnuts. Here we are in the children's garden, a fig leaf in the pavement, and in the library, one of the first ever published illustrations of a cactus, but in Oviedo's 1535 text. We celebrate the fruits of our world. Here's May Powell at 101 growing a 731-pound pumpkin there, and then we're on the other side of the other hemisphere on the same latitude, and we run in to the Japanese artist's pumpkin there, and that brings us just a couple of more minutes to how embedded nature is in our psyche. In fact, it's assumed that that humans even have a visceral, non-trained, non-learned, almost a native instinct to fear reptiles and serpents. And that's tied into, that's, by the way, that is a beautiful tapestry on the second floor, in the second room display in the second floor of the art gallery, an incredibly gorgeous piece. And that's tied into our whole idea about being, having been rejected from paradise, from Eden. And it's so curious, we weren't really rejected. Paradise was all around us all the time. We in earlier centuries, lived on paradise. The world was a paradise, and the transcendentalists understood that. They understood the nature of paradise is different from earlier renditions. Here's Church's Chimborazo, paradisical, a similar view. This is the Huntington which is the golden pot at the end of a rainbow in a winter storm. But paradise has been all around us. It's only now, as William Morris shows us in one of the stained glass windows in the art gallery, it's only now that we're not leaving paradise, we're destroying it. It is, we have come to an unsustainable era. In my innocence as a child, this is a picture of me digging earthworms, which we were using for fishing. And here's my first gardening picture. And what we need to pay attention to is that we've taken control of nature. We've so destroyed the mechanism of nature, and the world was our garden from one viewpoint. Today, the world is our garden, because gardening is the solution to how we will have to manage the world in the future, which means we've got a lot to learn. Every citizen is going to have to learn about the workings of nature and the balances and how to sustain nature, because otherwise we will lose probably the most important thing that was given to us over 3.5 billion years. So just in closing, this is Artist in Residence program in the Chinese garden. Here's Tangqing Yan. And he particularly pays attention to that. Artists are part of the beacon for us and how we look at the world. And here's one of his lectures at the Huntington. He borrowed the notion of the vessel of skin. Life is just like a vessel of skin. The quality depends on what you place inside it. My roots have lost their grip on the environment. They embody strength, spirit, and the possibility of hope. So the gardens, being at the Huntington, is a perfectly natural thing. The Thai is beautiful. The Huntington is a place where the sciences and the humanities actually are united. The sciences are one of the humanities. It's an important time for us. It's an important time for the Huntington. It's an important time for us to talk to our many audiences about how plants and gardens are part of the solution. It's really, as they say, it's good planets are hard to find. And I'm hoping that that our world is not as imperiled as I actually fear it is. But that story will be told by future generations. So I'm going to stop to share and get back to our questions. I'm back.
So I'm so glad we're recording all of this, Jim. I want to download all of your experiences and are trying to find out how to do that. But let's begin with some questions and pick up on some of your PowerPoint. And go back to the beginning. You started off talking about children and teaching children. And a big part of your legacy here is the Bing Children's Garden and making the Huntington a place for families and for kids, thinking about programming so that kids understand gardening. So I do want to go back to that picture you showed, your first garden picture. Of you as a plant lover or as a worm lover at an early age, and just to ask you about how your unique upbringing in Alabama really fed into your love of botany and your career path. Just tell us a little bit about you.
Keeping it brief, I think the place to start is to say that my grandmother and my mother, but my grandmother was a child of the Depression, and her probably the most often thing I heard her say that I remember was, "If you can't feed yourself, you will starve." It was a hard time, and we're in a hard time now, and I think there are going to be lessons from this. But the lesson for that generation was you need to be able to feed yourself, at least for my family. So as soon as we could get a piece of land big enough to grow a garden, I grew up in a world where we grew everything we ate that we could. It was not just to save money, and it wasn't just because a tomato right out of your garden is the best tomato you'll ever have. It was more of a philosophical approach to life. You need to know how to feed yourself. But there was another aspect to my world, and I just grew up loving plants and loving gardening and loving energy and physical activity. But the truth was that I was allowed the freedom. This is the South, and Faulkner lives in the South. Okay, I was allowed the freedom at the age of 10. The garden was mine. The yard was mine. I could do anything I wanted to, and everybody would just say, "Okay, what do you want to do?" So I think that growing up, given the freedom to, I would say, grow up at a young age, to take responsibility for something, and to be allowed the freedom to exercise judgment within limits, of course. Those things are wonderful, and I treasure that.
Let me pick up on what you said about growing up and feeling you needed to be self-sustainable, because as you point out, that is reappearing again. And especially during the pandemic, people are baking bread. They're really feeling the need for self-sustainability, even growing victory gardens, really going back to those times when it was so important to grow your own food, to have, to be self-sustainable. And you kind of were ahead of the curve here at the Huntington with the ranch garden and the wood fired oven. Can you just say more about bread making? I mean, you're a master, you've done workshops on all of that. What is so meaningful about that? Both that it's called up and surfacing now during the pandemic, but more generally, and I think you alluded also in your PowerPoint to bread making in different traditions.
Bread is just one of those almost hallowed substances in our culinary arsenal, and it's so basic. I mean, sometimes that's all you've got is a crumb of bread, and so at every level of life, from the most stressed and difficult all the way to the most wasteful and ebullient, bread plays a role. So I think bread's important. It's magical. You can have a substance that you store away from vermin and away from bugs in a barrel, and with a little bit of the help of a living substance or some chemical substance, a yeast or baking powder, you can turn that into food. It's kind of wonderful. Not only food, you can turn it into darned good food. And if anyone among you makes bread or makes biscuits, or makes pizza crust or flatbreads or yeast breads, whatever, the magical thing about bread is it's all in the hand. The same ingredients can make 1,000 different kinds of bread. It's the technique you know and the technique you enjoy, so that the same ingredients come together and you can get thousands and thousands of different things, almost all of which are either at least edible, if not delightful. So what I like to do is I love teaching kids to make bread, because it's kind of like swimming. It's a life skill. And you might not ever do it because you would say, I can't do that. I can't do math. I can't swim. I can't do that. But if early in life someone pushed you over that threshold, then the rest of your life, yeah, I can do that. That inertial barrier is gone. So my goal with kids has always been to eliminate inertial barriers, to empower them to create a more interesting and fulfilling life.
Let me follow up on that about kids, because you're enchanting when you talk about them. And I know we gave access to some of your biggest fans, your youngest fans, when we did a Ask Jim Anything video, which we'll give people links to later on. And I know that you got questions from children from how do you grow a giant pumpkin to what is the point of human existence? What were some of the things that you said it's so important to give them this freedom, to give them this confidence? How did that play out in some of the video? And we'll let people see it, so you don't have to tell us all of it, but I was fascinated by those questions.
You know, it's a sad thing to be 70 and keep finding things you wish you had done decades before. That is one thing I wish we'd been doing all along. The questions were amazing.
Wow.
The kids came up with just really good questions, surprising, and it was astonishing to see the depth of response you could give, and yet you only had 2 minutes and only a half a second to think about it. But they asked great questions and thoughtful questions, and I tried to just give them honest, simple answers, which is hard, right? So they're not simple answers always to everything. But like, what is the meaning of human existence? Well, that's, I mean, people have filled books, good books and bad books on that, right? And and I could just at the moment say, you know, for humans on Earth, it's kind of that old-fashioned thing to leave the Earth in better shape than you found it, to leave people in better shape, to share the Earth's bounty, not just with other humans, but to share it with all of those other heterotrophs and autotrophs that are trying to make it work out for us.
It's great. Well, I'm sure people will love seeing that, and we'll send them the link. Also in your PowerPoint, you showed pictures, images from the rest of our collections, including botanical. And 800,000 people annually come to the Huntington, and many of them say they come first to see the gardens. They walk through those gates and get to see these expansive, welcoming places. But you've always been very interested in the relationship between art and literature, history, and botany, which was evident in what you said. Can you connect some more dots? I know you've been thinking about this. I think you've been writing about it. And we don't have world enough in time for it all, but I'd love you just to give a snapshot of the way that you have thought about connecting the dots among our three extraordinary collections.
The first general observation is that there's, I don't know how many people have figured out, but it's pretty obvious that the Huntington collections cover most specifically the time that modern science was invented. So the Huntington collections in the library cover not just ancient things, they in a very detailed ways, they provide information on how, on the period of life and culture and humanities during which modern contemporary science was created. The collections in the Art Museum mirror all of that. There's direct connections between what's in the art galleries and what's in the library. One being what people think and write about these topics, and another being the creativity that flows from these very ways of looking at the world. So the collections between the art gallery and the library are rich in interconnections. But remember, the scientists were looking at the natural world. So the gardens then become the resource that so many of those things, so many of those scientific ideas were developed in the humanities, flowed from that. So it's almost impossible to think of one clean one out. There's some funny ones though. There's some really curious ones. the one that is curious to me is that here there's this iconic painting on the wall of this lovely girl named Pinky. That's the nickname for Pinky. Pinky grew up in Jamaica. Her parents and grandparents were sugar plantation owners, and they were wealthy in Jamaica, and they had huge connections still, family still in England. And typically, as you expect in many societies, she and her brother were sent back to England to be educated from the sugar plantations in Jamaica. So her grandmother in Jamaica requested that her relatives there in England, in London, have a painting made by a famous artist. And of course, they chose Lawrence, and Lawrence painted Pinky. Pinky then passed away. She died of disease. As one of the most tragic things in reading all this history is how many people died. It's amazing that anybody lived long enough to accomplish anything. So Pinky passes away, and all that's left is this painting that hangs in the family. And so she's a Barrett, the Barrett family. In fact, her brother had Barrett as his middle name and Barrett as his last name, because the Barretts only let you use family resources if you kept Barrett in your name. So here we have Barrett, and her brother then did survive, and her brother went on and had a family and lived in England. One of his daughters is Elizabeth Barrett, who then married Brown.
I thought you were going there.
And so Elizabeth Barrett Browning, so Pinky hanging on the wall in the art gallery is the aunt to Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who's plays out in the library. I mean, another one, there's a statue right near, there's this bust right near Pinky of Oliver Cromwell. Well, wasn't he a nasty one? And his whole play, with the scientists at the time, and all of a sudden that ties into Milton, because Milton was a Cromwell supporter, but he was so famous that he kind of survived the purge. And these people all were part of scientific societies, and their friends were busy discovering things in the natural world. The relationships between the plants in the garden, the collections, the living collections, the importance of plants at that time, and still gravely important. But this is the world of the beginning of imperialism, and plants were at the core of imperialism. So I'm going to stop there, but the connections are wonderful, and it makes, there's a lot of unplundered territory for us and our visitors.
Yeah, and a way of us looking at our own history, and scholars looking at our own history in ways that you've talked about, and the history of collecting, and what that meant as well. So lots of food for thought with that. Let me ask you, at our centennial launch, you talked about the act of planting trees, and you said it's an act of looking 80 to 100 years into the future, an investment in the future. So I'm going to ask you about trees, and ask you, what are your so-called top stock picks for trees? I mean, what do you say if people are the people who are listening? What recommendations do you have? You talked about the future. You talk about us preserving, helping, building the future, not destroying it. What would you recommend?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that if there is a most frequently asked question at the garden, it's what tree do I plant? Now, that comes from a homeowner's perspective. Typically, what they're really asking is, what tree can I plant small? It will grow very, very quickly to the size I want, and then it will never grow again, and it will flower, and it will do everything I want. It will have leaves, and then it will drop the leaves, but they will not mix with my lawn, and it will not get its roots in my sewer system, and it will be just a wonderful addition to my house, and it will improve the value and change my life. So the answer to that question is, yes, you can do all that, but you have to do it in parts. And trees are really important, and there are a lot of organizations dedicated to helping you select the right tree. I would say that you have to decide what you want the tree to do. And that means there's kind of a hit list that I would have of the best trees for Southern California. If you want shade, if you want tall shade, you're gonna have to wait a while. But there are trees that give you shade with no extra investment. For example, the native oaks, the Quercus agrifolia. I mean, how neat it is to plant a tree that once you get it through its first year of life, you never have to do anything else to it. On the other hand, if you want a tree that it's going to do something structural for your garden or contribute to some effect, then you have other good choices like the non-native ginkgo, or if you want a tree that will take care of itself, be green and stay out of your life, then there's this wonderful tree from Peru called Tipawana tipu. So the answer is that there are a lot of good trees. We have over 600 kinds of trees at the garden, but the best way to decide on a tree you want is to walk around your neighborhood and on your trips, pay attention. And if you see a tree that you think, that's the tree I want, then get it identified. I have been known to walk up to a front door, knock on the door, and ask someone, where did you get that tree? And people are always astonished that someone cares, and they actually are kind of pleased that someone paid attention to their own choices in life. So go around your neighborhood, look around, see what the trees are doing, ask your neighbors, was that a good choice? And that's where you'll get your answer.
Perfect. Okay, I want to give there, I know there are a lot of people who want to ask Jim anything or have particular questions. So I think Ben gave instructions that you can submit queries through the chat function, and Alice Sy, who's, thank you, Alice, for this, is going to help us look at the questions. And Alice is Assistant for Special Projects in the President's Office. So thanks, Alice. And we'll take some questions for Jim now from the audience.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Jim. And thanks to all of you who have submitted questions and comments. We'll make sure that Jim sees all of them, even if we don't get to them today. But first, one that's been asked multiple times. Jim, what's next for you? Where will you be living? What projects do you have? And can we book you as a speaker once COVID is over?
Okay, so here's a quick answer to that. So I'm not retiring, I'm graduating. I've matriculated for 36 years at the Huntington. I've learned a lot, and I hope I've left something behind. But as long as the brain works and the bones move and the muscles and all, then I will stay. I've got plenty to do to keep me busy. In fact, there are herbaria around the world wondering when I'm going to return specimens, and there are scientists and people and magazines wondering when I'm going to turn in text that they've asked me if I should write or at least edit. And so there's no shortage of things for me to do. And the Huntington has been an incredible learning ground for me. And you all have been incredible teachers, if nothing else, teaching me what I don't know. So what are we doing? Deb and I are road trip people. We love to go on road trips. That's why I recommended you go look at trees in people's yards. We're out looking at the world, and there's a lot of the world we've never seen, especially even in this country. We bought an Airstream trailer before everybody else decided to buy an Airstream trailer, which is, you won't find one today. They're all bought up, but we bought one 2 years ago. And we just intend to go out and explore some of those, the particulate parts of the world around us, those little places that you never have a chance to get into. And you always think, I wonder what's happening there. So hopefully we'll get to see some of that. And we'll get to come back to the garden from time to time and not butt in, but look in to see what's going on. I've got an electronic book that needs some attention because it's grown to over 1,000 pages and it needs to be broken into more intelligible pieces. And I have a website that I've been writing some of these things in that I hope to continue to develop. I do it for myself. Hopefully people enjoy reading it, but if they don't, that doesn't bother me because I do it to capture my own memories and make sense of the world around me.
Jim, can I just ask a little follow-up of that question from the folks who've asked it about your writing project, continuing Hurtrick's.
William Hurtrick's book.
William Hurtrick's memoir and history of the Botanical Garden. Just say a little bit about that.
So one of the delightful things about the Huntington is the personality of the place. And the personality depends not only on the objects and the choices and the design of the gardens. A lot of it comes from some of the past characters who brought it into life. And people in the art collections remember Bob Workin and what he brought to it. And he was there when I got here. And William Hurtrick was the first curator, director of the gardens at his semi-retirement. He wrote a series of recollections that are saccharine but wonderful, and they are the only history we have of this garden that starts with Mr. Huntington's original ownership of the land and his development and the relationship with the couple, with Henry and Arabella. Hurtrick was there the whole time, and so he wrote a really nice series of little essays about that. It's not a valid history, but we've reprinted it about 30 years ago, 25 years ago, and I would love to see that book linger in the consciousness and availability of people, but we would like to update it. And so one of the challenges I've accepted is to update Hurtrick's book without getting rid of Hurtrick. Bring more essays into it, and so here's the story. Here's his story about the gates. Here's his story about the trees around the mausoleum. Here's his story about the Japanese house. What other stories are fun and interesting that would complement that?
Thanks, Jim. And on the topic of projects, there are several questions and comments thanking you for your commitment to education and asking if you have plans to continue any of your educational series or pursue new ones.
I've already, unfortunately, probably accepted a couple of lectures. I told them that I don't take honoraria, but if they want to contribute to the Huntington to one of the endowments, then that would be nice. Maybe I can spend part of my retirement helping to continue to build endowments for the garden, which are crucial for the future of the enterprise. And so, yeah, because if you learn all this stuff and you don't convey it to other people, it's kind of meaningless. I mean, it may be personally satisfying, but in science, especially in taxonomy, there's an old phrase, don't get it right, get it writ. Because something not written and published or made available is something lost. A person can have all the understanding, they can put together all the thoughts they wish, but if they don't make that available, communicate that in a way that other people can take it and develop it further, it's not of great use. So the goal would be to get some of this written down before the mind no longer is capable.
Thank you, Jim. And on the topic of writing, many people are asking, for someone who wants to learn more about gardening in the plant world, where do you recommend starting with reading? What books does everyone need to have on their bedside stand?
Well, in every region, so there's two different ways of answering that. One is, what do you need to know about plants? And then the other one is, what do you need to know about gardening? And the truth is, there are basic skills for gardening that transcend all climates and all regions. But on the other hand, the other truth is each different region demands its own set of gardening skills and knowledge. So you would want to have a few general reference sources. I'd have to come up with a list with my staff, and we can post that later. But you'd also want to have some good advice locally. For example, every region of this country has a volunteer group called Master Gardeners. we work with the master gardeners very closely. And when we're open, when we get post-COVID and we open the garden back up, the master gardener's there every Saturday morning to answer questions. And probably the best place to get advice is by just asking someone who's a good gardener. But I'll come up with some books and some titles that people can, we'll make those available somehow through this, now that we know who's here and we can keep track of all that.
Thanks, Jim. So here's an interesting question. What are your favorite individual trees at the Huntington? And the questioner has specified you may choose up to 5, including in the parking lot and including those that are no longer standing.
Oh, well, so that's something I learned a long time ago. I learned ages ago that never choose a favorite tree, because that's the next one to fall. My deciding that a tree is my favorite tree seems to doom it to complete destruction. I remember, some of you might have been associated with Huntington for a long time. Remember, there was a great native oak, a Quercus engelmannii, in front of the library. And I remember one night thinking, at least during my tenure here, I hope that tree does not fall. Well, 2 weeks later, that tree came down in a windstorm, and we've replaced it twice, and now there's a beautiful Virginia oak there. But it seems like every time I decide that a certain tree is my favorite, the tree is doomed. So I've discontinued that habit. I will say that if you want to see the most beautiful Eucalyptus citriodora in Southern California, the one at the mausoleum is amazing. If you want to see the great tree of Thule disaggregated, then go to the lily ponds, and there are several Taxodium mucronatums that William Hurtrick collected the seed for in 1912. And you can see what it means, what you can do with a seed from a tree in the 108 years since that seed was collected in Mexico City. So there are a lot of cool trees around the Huntington. Perhaps the ones that are most evocative actually are the punjing and bonsai. So we have now, especially with the recent gift and partial gift, well, it was really all gift. We have an incredible collection of punjing. We also have a remarkable collection of bonsai. And I think in the country, there's no better collated collection of those trees, and they're very evocative, and some are on display right now out in the gardens.
Alice, can I ask, Jim, I'm going to ask you a question that came in from Stan Farrar, which is a national question. If you were willing to be
a shout out to Judith.
Oh, yes, yeah, sure. If you were willing to be the Secretary of Agriculture for the next administration, what would your priorities be?
Oh, that would be easy. The U.S. created the greatest agricultural system in the world, starting with the land-grant colleges. In the 1880s, we established laws that put in place agricultural research, and not only research, but created field stations and agricultural agents for every county. Over the past 30 years, I don't know what happened, why the decisions were made, but we have been dismantling that system. We are dismantling the greatest system that supported agriculture for small growers, not just mega farms, but small-time farmers and home people, home canning, home growing. Deb and I own a farm in our land in Missouri, and the county, when we bought it just 30 years ago, the county had several agricultural agents. Now, 3 counties are linked together and there's 1 agent. We have literally dismantled the system of support for farmers and farming, and we are dismantling the research, the applied research necessary. So I would move to put that back in place, because at the very time the worst diseases are impacting our crops, at the very time all of our crops are imperiled in some way or another, the U.S. has backed off in supporting agricultural research and applied use of agriculture. So that's a no-brainer.
Thanks for that great answer. Alice?
Thank you, Jim. So another question for you is, obviously the Huntington has a world-class botanical garden, but thinking about other gardens around the world, what are the bucket list gardens that you would recommend?
Oh man, okay. Well, how far do you want to travel, right? There are great gardens. Every garden is great. Okay, so I'm not gonna, but if you want to see a garden spectacle, go to Singapore. And the whole island is a garden, but go to the Botanical Garden and go to Gardens by the Bay. That's a transformative experience. The cloud forest they've built there is unbelievable. If you want to see horticultural perfection with about as much passion as you can throw at it, then go visit Longwood in southeastern Pennsylvania. Not far from, in fact, probably some of the greatest gardens, or many of the greatest gardens of North America are in the Philadelphia area. So if you want to see great gardens and you don't want to have to travel to Europe, then go to the Philadelphia area and visit Longwood, visit Chanticleer, visit the various arboreta around there, Winterthur, the other DuPont estates, Hagley and Mount Cuba. There are wonderful gardens in this country, across the country, and I would say help those gardens out. Go visit them and do something to promote them.
Thanks, Jim. And in your 30 plus years, what has been your greatest surprise at the Huntington?
Oh, wow. I'm not able to come up with the exact answer, maybe by the end. Let's go through some more questions and I will let that wander around in the back of my mind and see what the greatest surprise might have been.
Okay, so this one is another one looking back. Jim, what is the plant that has eluded you?
Oh, that's easy. Rafflesia. So if I were going to be here another 4 decades, I would try to talk people into building a special greenhouse just to grow the vines and trees we need in the Sapondaceae, and I would work through all of the regulations to get my hands on some material of Rafflesia so we could actually flower Rafflesia, which makes the world's largest flower, individual flower, not the world's largest inflorescence, the world's largest flower, but it's a parasite. You have to have everything right, and it's all from Borneo in that region of the world, and that's the holy grail of exotic plant.
How about your most challenging, the garden that's been the most challenging for you and your team to develop? And are there any areas that you think are underappreciated at the Huntington?
You know, the neat thing about the Huntington is how many strong landscapes we have. The desert garden by itself, if you cut it out and it were a freestanding institute, it would still be one of the great botanical gardens of the world. The Asian gardens now with the Chinese garden, and someday I hope after we're gone, Karen, the Korean garden, make up the most intellectually underpinned approach to Asian garden culture and history in the world. So that's, I don't know how appreciated it is, but when I look at the gardens around the art gallery, the original gardens to the Huntington, we have the world's best rosarian. We have a fabulous collection of roses. We have, everywhere I look, the Huntington is blessed to have great strengths. Underappreciated, people would argue with me. I don't know if it's possible to appreciate the desert garden at the level of that it should be appreciated. is non-parallel. It's not equal to anywhere else in the world. But that's just me talking.
I visited the desert garden. I mean, Alice is there right now. I visited the desert garden with two young architects, two husband and wife architect team. And all they could talk about was composition, color, shape. I mean, it was a way that garden needs to be appreciated among all the other ways that you've cataloged as being such an incredible, it would stand on its own, which I think is very, very true.
Yeah, it's like if someone asks you, what is your favorite, which child do you like best? And of course, the answer is always the one that's giving me least trouble at this very moment. But it's not possible to choose the one you like the most. Give me some categories and I'll tell you the ones that best fit those categories.
Okay.
Thanks, Jim. Several people have asked for Jim's blog, so I've sent that via the chat for anyone who is interested. You'll also get a follow-up email with some links, including to the videos that Karen mentioned and the link to contribute to the equipment fund. But going back to the questions, Jim, what is one lesson in leadership that you've learned from working with plants that you can share with us?
Patience. The greatest lesson that I would convey to anyone working in a garden or working in any field is take the time to realize that few things are done in a day. Trees, you planting a seed, you're thinking 30 to 100 years in the future. The gardens that we have created, and it's not me, I mean, I'm the cheerleader. Maybe I get credit for vision, but really it's taken hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people to make all this happen. And it's taken years and years of discussion, association, thinking, planning, fundraising, creation, and it's going to take another few centuries of maintenance and continued development to bring life to those gardens. So if you go into a project and you just are going to toss yourself at it, get it done quickly, and then walk away, you're not going to get much done. Patience and perseverance are not perhaps incredible skills, but I think they are incredibly important if you want to get something done.
Jim, excuse me, you ended on a note of kind of caution, the PowerPoint, about where we're going. And there's a question, it's hard not to be pessimistic about our fate sometimes, yet you seem optimistic. What sustains your optimism? I think you've conveyed that, but is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
The pessimism comes from the fact that the earth we inherited is so rich in life and diversity. In some of our lifetimes, half of that diversity will have disappeared irrevocably. The world will persist, but it will certainly be a fraction of what we inherited. So the reality, it's not even pessimism, it's reality, is that we are going to lose so much. The optimism is that I don't think people especially want to lose that. I think people really would like to help, and this crosses all sorts. I can't imagine anyone just callously thinking that thousands and thousands of organisms going extinct is okay. So the optimism is, I think, even with some of the worst aspects of human nature, humans do love, it's called biophilia. Humans love the world in which, can you imagine all of those wonderful Star Trek episodes? Did you ever see a potted plant? I never saw an African violet. I never saw a rubber tree, but I can't imagine someone taking off into space, a whole bunch of humans inhabiting this metal plastic can without carrying a few little plants with them. because we need them. They're important to us, and I think they're important to people. So the optimism is, I think human nature inclines us to want to save these things.
Fabulous.
And Jim, following up on that, one of the questions was, how can botanical gardens contribute towards sustainability of the planet? From June Lee.
Well, first off, we have to practice what we preach, and we continue to try to improve. It's really hard. Modern gardening, we've been trained to do things the fast and wasteful way. If you went back, we call it in the ranch garden, we call it back to the future. 100 years ago, no person running their own garden in California would be so wasteful as contemporary gardeners can be. You go to the store, you buy plants that are fully grown, they're in big plastic tubs that no one knows how to recycle. Go back to some of your training, you will find it's a lot of fun to grow plants from seed. And you will find that working the soil and making the soil beautifully adept at growing the plants that you wish to grow is very satisfying. It's a very wonderful way to comport your life. We need to eliminate the waste in gardening, and we need to showcase the fact that we have done that. So one is practice what we preach. Another is to tell people the truth about, learn some more science. Trust science. Science theoretically is what we know objectively because we studied it and we learned it. Science is not especially a religion. Science is just established fact. Learn those and use those to make decisions.
I think that's a great note to end on. Alice, thanks so much for your contribution. Jim, let me just tell our audience, and Alice has alluded to some videos. So we've commissioned a number of videos in honor of Jim, and it's kind of an extension of our program. Ask Jim Anything is one of them, but there's a selection celebrating our Jim of all trades. One is about jam coming from the petals from the centennial rose that one of our staff has made, exploring secrets of the Bing Children's Garden. And Jim does one on the wonders and utility of botanical drawing, which is absolutely fascinating. So for those of you, 500 and more folks who have been listening to our program, there's a lovely link that you can have to hear more of this, which a lot of your questions address. There's no way, Jim, to say thank you. We'll keep doing this. Thank you for being part of why it matters and making so clear why it does. I also want to thank Alice, Eric Allen, Donnie Rudine, Ben Tuttle, Kate Zankowitz, all of whom spent many hours, much time on the videos, and the botanical staff and communications team for doing this. And thank you, everybody who participated in this event. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us. And thank you, Jim.